and that uncertainty doesn't feel good. It's the blueprint in which people enter relationships in.
Why do many people with trauma histories default to overgiving or overfunctioning in relationships?
Yeah, well, because when you're a child and you experience parents who are in survival mode, are at the hands of their addictions, have codependent relationships, and there's fighting going on, there's a lack of safety. There's a lack of safety that the child experiences. And that lack of safety doesn't feel good. And that uncertainty doesn't feel good. So we take on behaviors of overfunctioning, overgiving, overthinking, all the overs in order to not feel this fear, in order to gain control of an uncontrollable scenario. So you really want to look at all behavior as an attempt to regulate. So overfunctioning, overgiving is my way of trying to make everybody around me feel okay so that I can feel safe. It's to avoid the feeling of being out of control. It's to avoid, or it might be from some of my clients who were raised or born in a family where they didn't have an invitation to exist. There was a whoopsie, or some people even are told by their parents, you were a mistake. You were a mistake. We did not want to have you. And then we were stuck with you. Can you imagine being a child and hearing that? So now if I hear that as a child, then what do I want to do? Well, I want to do everything I can to earn my place, to right to exist. So I'm going to overfunction. And maybe if I can be useful to you, then I have a right to exist, which is really heartbreaking when you think about it. But this is how people enter relationships.
Yes, it is. And it's quite demoralizing to be told you were a mistake.
Yeah.
I don't see children as mistakes. I see them as blessings anyway.
But the thing is that sometimes, depending on the situation, a couple gets pregnant, they didn't mean to, and there was maybe rape, or there was maybe, just this experience of like resentment, and that resentment that they feel about having the child, because it's a big responsibility. I have one kid and I had him late in life, and I was financially prepared, emotionally prepared. I had done my work, and still it's hard at times. I can't imagine being in my mid-20s, never having done my healing work, being in survival mode and being at odds with the person that I'm living with, and now having the responsibility of a child. It can get overstimulating and overwhelmed, especially if you have 4 or 5 of them. So I have compassion towards a parent that's in survival mode. It's just that the message the child gets is that it doesn't feel safe to rest in love. I must earn it. So the foundational premise and identity is based on, I can't rest in love. I must fight and earn the right to receive it. And so that is very insidious. It's very nuanced. It's very subtle. And that becomes the template, the blueprint in which people enter relationships in. So,
or function.
That's how they function. And that's why they just can't feel safe in receiving, or they're constantly going from one abusive relationship to another, not because it's their fault at all, but because deep down in the core of their being, even before they had the language to describe it, they have this premise that they just are fundamentally undeserving of good treatment, and they're just deserving of abuse. So that sense of deserving is why they, somebody who feels deserving, soon as you mistreat them, they're like, I'm out of here. But for somebody with that profile that truly deep down in their core believes that they're not worthy, when the abuse is happening, they don't have this red flag that says, I got to get out of here. They think, maybe I deserve this, and I'm just going to keep trying to prove myself worthy. And that's really sad, but it can be healed.
So, how do spinal tension and nervous system, I know this is your area of expertise, the regulation reinforce codependent patterns?
It's a big leap when you're talking about spinal tension and then codependency. The two are not really related, Grace. It's spinal tension is if you're bracing, if you're living a life where you're constantly bracing because you don't feel safe where you are, you're bracing, you're going to create spinal tension. So that's about the only link between these two things. You know, somatic work that I don't do chiropractic anymore, but somatic work is really about like getting curious about where you're bracing and learning how to meet your bracing where you are and open up. And so there's nothing, you're bracing a lot when you're in a codependent relationship because you're always scanning and tracking the other person's mood. And if they're not okay, then you're not okay. And you just want them to be okay. So you abandon yourself so that they can be okay. And that's the link between the two. But I'd rather just completely separate the spinal tension, codependency, and two completely separate things. It's as separate as, you know, headaches and codependency, digestive problems and yeah, if you're in codependency, you're feeling a lot of stress and then it'll manifest physically. It's not a direct link.
What practices help someone move from people-pleasing to authentic self-expression without guilt?
Yeah. This is a tough one and it's very counterintuitive, and there's no way around it except to do one thing. You have to expand your capacity to feel guilt. The fantasy is, I want to be able to say no to you and not feel guilt. And that's a fantasy, Grace. There's no such thing as a guilt-free boundary unless you've been practicing it for a long time. So at first, what I tell people is, you can't, guilt is actually the price of admission to break the cycle. Guilt is the price of admission. You must choose guilt because you've been choosing resentment. So by people pleasing, what you're doing is you're saying no to feeling guilt and you're saying yes to feeling resentment instead. So you're bypassing guilt and you're trading it in for resentment towards the other person deep down, because now they're the villain that made you did say yes in the first place, and then resentment towards yourself for being so weak that you can't stand up for yourself. So what happens is, by people pleasing, essentially you're saying yes to resentment and no to guilt. And the practical thing to do is to reverse that and choose guilt instead of resentment. Expand your capacity to sit with the feeling of guilt without collapsing, without going into dissociation, without melting into a puddle. And it is very hard work. It's very counterintuitive. And this is the work. So the fantasy is, how do I do this without guilt? And I just jump in and go, you don't. You do it with guilt at first. So you choose guilt.
What you're saying is healthier to choose guilt than resentment.
Healthier, it depends on the situation, right? Because it's not a one size fits all, but generally speaking, you can say that guilt is a real tough one for many those who have codependency. This fear of being seen as the bad guy, fear of being vilified, fear of, being bad, right? So I'm just going to avoid guilt altogether. And so what does that mean? I'm going to say yes when my body says no. So in my effort to avoid guilt, I say no to myself and I abandon and betray myself, which then eventually leads to signs and symptoms and disease. So because I want to avoid guilt. So if you want to get healthy, then you're going to choose to become really good at alchemizing guilt. And then that way you don't have to be resentful. So you want to know the classic example of this is women when they hit menopause. So women, when women hit menopause, this lifelong period of time where they've been fawning and people pleasing and betraying themselves and abandoning themselves in order to please others, in order to be seen as the good girl, in order to be dutiful, it reaches a boiling point, and that something happens around menopause where they decide, okay, enough people pleasing. I'm now resentful. I'm angry. Now the pendulum swings to the other side, and out of rage, they start choosing themselves. And it's a very challenging period, especially in a marriage, when the husband is going, what the heck is going on? And if the woman isn't really understanding what's happening is she's now deciding that she's no longer going to swallow her resentment anymore. She's going to express it. And now she gets to experience a life where she's got to work through the guilt of choosing herself, because now she's gone from fawner to, oftentimes the pendulum is swinging, becoming, as some would say, assertive. Some would even use the B word, bitchy. And it's like, oh, feeling the guilt of all of that. And this all could have been averted if everybody became more aware, husband and wife, but the woman expanding her capacity to feel guilt and say no at times, and say that doesn't work for me, or I'm not available for that, or that doesn't land for me, or I can't support this, and be more open and honest and truthful with what's happening within her.
That sounds interesting. Be safe and be positive. And don't forget to check out our social media handles. Thank you. Bye for now.